Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. According to ABI Research, less than 5% of critical industrial infrastructure is monitored for threats. The company also reports that by 2030, industrial environments will house more than 1.2 billion connection points for machines and production systems. So, while it's impossible to be all places at all times, this growth in connectivity will place a greater strain on security resources even after prioritizing data and network assets and focusing on the most pressing potential vulnerabilities. Throw in data from Rapid, the largest API hub in the world, showing that over 60% of API users are in manufacturing, and it becomes easy to understand how the industrial attack surface continues to expand and create new opportunities for the bad guys. This is certainly not a new headline for the industrial sector, but it helps to reinforce that targets of opportunity for potential distributed denial of service, malware, and other attacks continues to grow. This also reinforces the need for cybersecurity investment and developing strategies to ward off and respond to new and increasingly complex attackers. These are dynamics that our guest for today's episode knows all too well. But before we talk to him, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Pentera. For more information on how automated security validation can help you safely test all your IT security controls with the click of a button in a non-stop industrial operational environment, visit Pentera.io. It's now my pleasure to introduce Huxley Barbee, Security Evangelist at runZero, a leading provider of cyber asset management solutions, to Security Breach. Huxley, thanks so much for joining us today. You know, when it comes to the industrial sector, manufacturers understand inventory management, but they're usually thinking about durable goods, hard products, whatever you want to say that they can see on the shelves and track. When it comes to their digital assets and the Industry 4.0 type inventory, not so good at it in terms of understanding all their connection points and all this new technology is sort of bringing to the table. Maybe you could offer some thoughts from your experiences in terms of helping manufacturers understanding sort of their digital inventory a little bit, and then maybe some strategies that you've learned that can help them in managing those things a little bit better.
Yeah, sounds good. I think one of the first things is to know is that from a security perspective, the digital infrastructure within these manufacturing organizations was never really under any sort of governance. Everything just sort of grew organically. Different PLCs were just added, haphazardly and things like this. Actuators and valves were just like hooked up willy-nilly without anybody sort of getting any sense of, what is going to be the methodology or the way to do this that would really help from a cybersecurity defense perspective. And so pretty much every single organization is just this hodgepodge of devices that are just strewn together in a haphazard way. I think the other really important thing to consider is that a lot of the cybersecurity innovation that we have seen in the last 20 or even 30 years was really focused on the IT side.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity vendors, they have been introducing security controls, and there's been a lot of security awareness that has been set out there in the world, but mostly from an IT perspective, right? I think there was a time when, 20 years ago, where the idea of having even like antivirus on your laptop was just foreign, but now everybody has some sort of agent running on their laptop that's protecting them. But on the OT side, that sort of innovation never really took off for reasons that we can discuss in this conversation. So those are two primary reasons why we got to where we are today in terms of, I'll venture to say the mess that we have in manufacturing in terms of cybersecurity.
No, I'd agree. You kind of set me up perfectly for a couple of different things that we like to talk about too. First of all, when it comes to adding all of those different components, all those different technologies that come along with Industry 4.0 and expanded automation, a lot of the component suppliers will talk about, hey, we've got security embedded within all of these components, but a lot of times the customer, the manufacturer, isn't hooking them up for whatever reasons, whether it's speed, helps with the integration process, they forget to turn it back on, whatever the case may be. I'd kind of like to get your thoughts in terms of the secure by design element that component suppliers are providing, and is it just simply not being utilized by the end user, or are there other deficiencies there that maybe we don't talk about enough?
Yeah, so this might be controversial to say. I would say relative to IT, OT devices are insecure by design. Even now, there are some that do not use encryption by default, where they're sending traffic over the network that in a way that is plain text, right? You might claim that, hey, there have been some strides towards this on the OT side, but relative to IT, it is insecure by design. And I think another really important part of this is the mentality around security, right? So in conventional wisdom for cybersecurity, there's this CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And on the IT side, arguably, confidentiality is considered a little bit more important than the other two, right? Because if you were to lose customer data, that is, a major sin, right? Not only do you have terrible reputational damage, but you could also potentially be fined by regulatory organizations for having lost customer data. On the OT side, though, in manufacturing, it's all about availability as opposed to confidentiality and integrity, right? Every second that your OT devices are down is potential revenue loss, right? That conveyor belt needs to keep rolling and building products. Yeah. Otherwise, there's material impact to the business. And for that reason, there you see certain ramifications. Primarily, what you're seeing is a lack of application of proper security governance. Even if, as you said, the device were designed with security in mind, those security controls are not necessarily being applied. What you often see are devices that continue to have default usernames, default passwords, listening on default ports, and basically not being reconfigured in such a way to make things more difficult for the attacker. Another ramification of this idea that availability is paramount is not patching and not updating.
Okay.
A lot of organizations do not want to take any downtime in order to run an update on an OT device in order to be more secure. They also want to avoid the possibility of a bad update, which might introduce additional downtime. And so, with that sort of mindset, even if these devices were secure by design, which is arguable in my opinion, you still have a situation where it's sort of open field for the adversary, right? Yeah. Once they are able to get some sort of foothold into your OT environment, it's basically free reign to laterally move throughout the organization to infiltrate whatever, right? And I don't care if you might have some plan to apply the Purdue model to your OT environment, to your factory, where you're stratifying different OT devices away from each other, where access among layers is adjudicated by some sort of network security control. For the fact of the matter is, there are many organizations where Purdue is like sort of a plan, but not something that they have today. And we can go on Shodan right now and find PLCs that are directly connected to the internet, which is not supposed to happen with Purdue, right? Because they're considered layer one, and they have default usernames and default passwords, and they've not been updated. So, all the different exploits that have been published by CISA about that particular device is usable by the attacker.
Yeah, it's mind blowing to think that there's still default username and passwords being utilized out there for such critical infrastructure, especially in the OT environment. Circling back a little bit, you say it's insecure by design. If that's the case with a lot of these components and these add-ons that we're seeing, where does the responsibility lie? Does it rely with the supplier of the technology or component, or does it rely with the customer and the end user and how they're attaching it to their automation infrastructure?
It really depends. I mean, it's a shared responsibility at the end of the day, right? The vendor of the device needs to have developed it in such a way that it's amenable to security. But once it's been purchased, and if the levers are there and the organization's not using them, then that's really on that on that organization.
Absolutely. Do you think there's a gap in terms of education between the supplier and the consumer? Is the consumer just thinking, hey, I've done this before, I know how to plug this in and make it work, and there's not enough talk about cybersecurity in that conversation of the purchase? Or is it just a time thing where they just don't want to bother with it right now?
There's always room for laziness, true, but I think a lot of it is awareness.
Yeah.
In with the organizations that I met before, the OT engineers are really focused on operational efficiency, making it work, and security is secondary if considered at all. And as right around, like, let's say around 2005 or so, like, we had that shift where from OT environments being entirely air gapped to OT environments starting to be connected.
Yep.
Right? This whole sense of having to send somebody out to the field in order to go look at the device to fix it or to manage it became something that wasn't that organizations wanted to optimize for. So they wanted to be able to do remote management. So they started connecting all these OT networks to their IT networks or even over the internet in order to increase operational efficiency, allow for remote management and things like that. And there was just basically no consideration for what that would mean from a security perspective. In fact, it meant that now, rather than having to walk up to the factory in order to compromise a device, now you can have somebody from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, being able to tap into your factory now over the internet because you, the organization, wanted to connect that to the internet to make things easier for management purposes. So that right there, like, basically right from the start of this sort of trend, we've seen this whole ignorance, if you will, of the cybersecurity perspective to OT management. And it continues today. It continues today. I remember hearing the story about how there was this one OT device, I forget what it was exactly, and it was actually compromised by a hacker. But the OT engineers took a look at it and said, you know what? Seems like a device malfunction, right? And so this whole the whole sort of like clue into like exactly what actually happened in that particular incident was just sort of like washed away, and the assumption was made that it was some sort of mechanical failure instead, right? That's another really good example of how, like, cybersecurity is not really top of mind within OT environments as much as it should be, I would say.
Yeah. Do you think that's just a paradigm shift right now? Is there something else getting in the way? Is it just like you said before, they're OT guys, they're focused on getting things up and running, and cybersecurity is just not a priority right now? Or is there something else getting in the way there?
I think a lot of it is education. There's also some issues, of course, with tooling, right? We could say, hey, you need to go and improve your cybersecurity, but without the proper tooling, what are they going to do, right? They just throw their hands up and say, okay, well, show me. What should I do? Yeah.
Do you think there's awareness within industrial organizations? Because we're talking about manufacturing, we're also talking about utilities and other infrastructure-focused entities, that they need this OT security expertise. Do they realize that they need that, in your opinion? Or is it still something of, hey, we got it up and running, that's all we ask of these guys?
I think it's just security in general. Security leaders, CISOs, and so on and so forth, are always trying to educate the board and the business leaders the value of this part of security or that security knowledge or these security tools and things like this. And while in IT, on the IT side, there's been a lot of progress in that sense. There's, you go to the board and say, hey, we need to invest here or there for cybersecurity. There might be some debate, but there's no debate that, hey, this is a necessary investment. I think on the OT side, there's got to be still some of that, right? Simply because it's just, the journey that we started on the IT side started, in the 80s, 90s, whereas on the OT side, it's still a nascent problem, if you will.
It's interesting. We had another guest on the show who actually said that a lot of these ransomware attacks are actually helping to elevate awareness in a lot of other organizations, because you got to talk about, if you paid a ransom, it comes out on those quarterly calls. There's money missing, in other words, and it elevates the understanding of that. And he even went so far as to say it's actually helping get additional resources for other organizations for cybersecurity in the OT environment, because nobody wants to pay a ransom. Would you agree with that? Is that sort of a positive byproduct, if you will, of the escalation of ransomware attacks in the OT environment?
That is unfortunately true, right?
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever had a friend who didn't have a home security system until after they got robbed?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's human nature. Like, until the problem happens to us, we don't necessarily make the investment to prevent it in the future. And I'll also add that every CISO knows to never let a good breach go to waste. The best of CISOs actually have, request lists, if you will, that they have ready to go, because they know they have a 72-hour window after a breach to ask for a whole bunch of things that they want. And so they have that list ready to go. It's a foregone conclusion that at some point you're going to get breached. So you might as well make sure you're going to get the right investment out of it. And so the best CISOs actually have all that stuff ready to go. But yes, I agree with the other speaker. It is true, but it's unfortunately true.
Yeah, very true. You've made a couple of comments too about one of the issues, and we've seen this before in terms of OT security, is we're trying to almost take a cut and paste approach from IT approaches, and it just does not translate. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how the dangers of trying to take IT and translate it over to OT, some of the shortfalls that are inevitably going to show themselves?
Yeah, so you got to understand, right? One thing I mentioned is before, confidentiality is more important in IT, but on the OT side, it's about availability. You also got to think about the types of devices that you have.
Yeah.
On the IT side, generally speaking, there's a lot of homogeneity, right? Pretty much every device is either Linux or Windows or Mac. On the OT side, you have somewhere north of 50 different types of real-time operating systems as opposed to time-sharing operating systems. Also, the network stacks on these OT devices are not quite as well tested for robustness or resilience. And the same thing goes for the applications on top of the network stack. And there's also just a lot of variety in OT. Yeah. Right? There's been more and more standardization, of course, where you're seeing PLCs working in different environments, but the type of OT device that you have in manufacturing is going to be different than the electrical plant, which is going to be different from a sign on the freeway, right? Like, these are all very different devices that are in the various environments, because they're designed for a specific purpose, and the testing for it is basically quality assurance as to whether or not the device is responding properly to somebody pressing a button, and not some arbitrary traffic coming over the network. On the IT side, that's sort of robustness testing has happened for quite some time. There's also been a lot of innovation in terms of software engineering, release engineering, software development lifecycle, and things like that you see on the IT side, which isn't as common on the OT side, partly because of the variety of operating systems, completely different programming languages that you have on the OT side. So for that reason, you also see less security innovation, right? nearly all the laptops these days have some sort of endpoint detection and response software on them, some sort of agent that's type malware. You can't just take that EDR agent and just put it onto an OT device. You can't just put it onto a PLC. It's not supported, right?
Yeah.
And so attempting to sort of copy and paste some types of security controls from IT to OT don't necessarily work. You could do network level controls like firewalls and IPSs and things like this, but the same type of granularity that you have on the IT side is not going to happen with OT, at least not right now, right? That could change over the next 5 to 10 years, of course.
I think you bring up a great point about the different operating systems, a lot of the different programming languages that are used in the OT environment. And I think that also feeds into a false sense of security with OT security specialists, because they think this is so diverse, this is so unique, it's going to be tougher to hack into. But obviously we're finding out that's not really the case. I mean, hackers are still getting in.
Absolutely not. CISA, go to the CISA website. There are published exploits for all sorts of OT devices. And given the fact that many of these OT devices are not updated or not patched because availability is so important, those exploits are going to work. And it's not as if you have to jump through hoops to exploit them. You could use off-the-shelf, quote unquote, off-the-shelf open source tools to execute those exploits. Metasploit has OT exploit modules in it. They're ready to go. You just, type in a few numbers and hit enter, and boom, like there it is. So yeah, I mean, even on the IT side, the sort of security through obscurity, like that used to be true at one point, but now you can scan the entire internet in like 6 minutes, depending on the bandwidth that you have. I feel like on the OT side, definitely there was in the past security by obscurity, but also security by isolation, right? Because everything used to be air gapped. Yeah. And both of those are no longer true, right? Yeah. Those curtains have all come down, and it's basically like a greenfield holiday for the adversary, like on the OT side. And I think this is probably why we see a lot more OT incidents than we in the past, because it's just so easy. Like if I were the attacker and I have to spend like 10 hours to try and infiltrate an IT network, it takes me like 5 minutes to do the OT network. Yeah, I'm gonna go do that instead, right? The ransom money is just as good. Like why am I doing the hard thing?
Well, and you made a great point before too about the dwell time of some of these hackers. They'll get in, they'll hit you, and then they stay in the system because people don't have enough visibility to kick them out or know that they're still there. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about maybe some of your personal experiences, or even some strategies on how do you get them out. You know that they got in and they hit you because they told you. How do you get them out?
First things first is you need to know what you have. That is the number one thing, right? If you look at CIS controls, like having an understanding of what you actually have on the network is where you start. You're not going to kick them out of something you don't even know about, right? Yeah. So you got to start with asset inventory, and even that is something that's difficult to do on the OT side, right? On the IT side, there are lots of solved ways to solve that problem. On the OT side, it's actually much more difficult. A lot of that is because these OT devices are not as well tested for robustness or resilience. They're much more fragile to the type of techniques that have been attempted on IT sites. So this is another good example of how you can't just copy and paste from IT to OT. There have been unpublished stories about attempts at doing what we call active scans on OT environments that have resulted in severe outages to the point where even human life might have been jeopardized, right? And this is not just medical, like OT, but even like power plants and manufacturing and things like this. Yeah. So, in order to really get a good understanding of all the things that you have in your OT environment, you need to apply some solution that is well tested for OT.
One thing I would like you to clarify a little bit, you talked about vulnerability scanning and some of the things you have to be careful there. How is that different potentially than like penetration testing or things of that sort?
Vulnerability management is focused on what could happen, even if it might never ever happen, right? Whereas with penetration testing, it tells you what truly is possible,
Right. Okay.
right? So let's say you have a safe in your house in some deep dark room deep inside your house, and you did not lock that safe. That would be a vulnerability. But can a burglar actually steal something from that safe? Well, if it just so happens that all of your windows are shut, all your doors are gated, and it's impossible for somebody to even get to that room where that safe is, well, then that vulnerability is actually pretty low priority, right? So a penetration test would actually figure out what could happen, what is reasonable in terms of what could happen, and actually validates that particular vulnerability is something that could be exploited, as opposed to something that's more theoretical. Because if you look at it, the number of vulnerabilities that's published by the NVD is growing all the time, right? It's now in the tens of thousands, and more than 50% of vulnerabilities are categorized as high or critical, right? If everything is critical or high, then nothing is. And so you need some way of prioritizing those vulnerabilities, especially given that only 5% of vulnerabilities are ever exploited, right? Only 5% are exploited, but more than half are high and critical. That means you need to find some other way of prioritizing those vulnerabilities. And there are different ways of doing this. Doing a penetration test is one way of doing it. You could also check to see if the vulnerability has been exploited in the wild, whether or not there's some sort of automation for it, and things like this. But also, more importantly, understanding not just what that device is, but where that device is on the network, and whether or not that device has additional insecure configurations that might make it a more easy target, is something that you would consider.
Feels like this just keeps coming right back to visibility and understanding what's going on within your network and being able to assess that on a timely basis. I think
visibility is number one. Visibility is number one, and having that current is a huge part of that. There's so many organizations that are still using spreadsheets for their asset inventory, and that is out of date the moment it's published, right? And many organizations try to use a passive network monitor, but of course, implementing that type of solution takes a very long time. It is difficult to do. And then oftentimes organizations don't even get the full visibility that they want, because they can't set up a passive network monitor on as many network choke points as necessary. And so it's basically a huge money pit for many organizations with very low return on investment.
Interesting. So are there any attackers or types of attacks that you're seeing being especially difficult right now, or kind of on your radar, so to speak?
Difficult in what way?
In terms of, are there any types of attacks that are expanding in use, or types of strategies that hackers are using that you've seen really grow recently?
Yeah, there's recently things like MFA exhaustion, things like this. My initial reaction to these types of questions is that it might be a little bit misleading, because a lot of the old stuff is still out there, right? You can still, as an attacker, be successful with Eternal Blue, right? Even though that tool was released 6 years ago, right? We got to focus on the basics. A lot of this attention on what is this APT doing, or this novel hack, it's a bit misleading. It's very sexy, of course, it's very topical, and in the news people like to talk about what these organizations are doing with this novel way of hacking. But for most organizations, you should be really focused on the basics and making sure that the last 20 years of hacks are mitigated within your organization. So not to poo-poo on the question, but
we've heard that before, and I think that is the biggest concern right now, or the biggest lack of concern, if you will, is people are looking more at, okay, we know about our evil and the colonial pipeline hit. We don't want that to happen, but they forget about some of the basic stuff and some of the smaller organizations that are still going to wreak havoc if they get in there. So blocking and tackling is always a good place to start, without a doubt. Absolutely. So, Huxley, this has been awesome. Love talking to you about all this stuff. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about runZero, some of the work that you guys do, and how you fit into industrial cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. So runZero is a cyber asset management solution that is the fastest and easiest way to get to a full asset inventory. And runZero can find all types of devices, whether those be IT or IoT or OT. And it doesn't matter where those devices are. They could be on-premise in the factory, on-premise in the office, in the cloud, or even in remote employees' homes. And runZero is potentially unique in that we believe you can actually do active scanning within OT environments, right? In a world where the conventional wisdom says you have to do passive network monitoring, we actually have the capability of doing active scanning successfully in manufacturing, find all the devices in the factory, and so on and so forth. We additionally have a new passive traffic sampling capability that we're about to release in the next month. It's different from a passive network monitor. We're not, it's not a solution that requires these big beefy hardware appliances or anything like that. But that active scanning capability that we've honed over the last few years, with the addition of this passive traffic sampling capability that we have, we believe makes us a super good fit for any sort of manufacturing environment that wants to get a good handle on their asset inventory as a basis of a proactive security program.
Awesome. No, it makes a lot of sense. And we've been talking about that a fair amount in the course of a lot of these questions and solving critical issues. So interesting to hear. We've also thrown out a ton of abbreviations and things like that, if you will. The one we haven't talked about is AI, artificial intelligence, which is getting a lot of attention right now in cybersecurity. Love to get your take in terms of who's going to use it more, the good guys, the bad guys. Where does it sort of fit in the scheme of things?
Well, I think the bad guys are already using it more, based on some of the things I've seen, some of the attacks, and even like hacking ChatGPT itself is already a thing, right? This goes back to the whole idea that there's this asymmetry in cybersecurity. It takes one person with a laptop to launch a global attack, but the defenders requires millions of dollars of investment in tools and training and all this stuff. It's an asymmetric problem, and so I 100% believe that the bad guys are going to be using AI a lot more than the defense. Defense will catch up at some point, but defense is always on the back foot, at least for as long as I've been in the industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that kind of, not that we like that's the dynamic we're working with, but it kind of circles back to your comments about let's start with eliminating some of the basic threats and vulnerabilities, and then we can work our way up. Let's take care of the simple stuff first. Use that time to catch up and use tools like AI potentially to provide greater defensive measures to head off some of the bigger attacks as well. Some of the other trends that we hear a lot about when it comes to especially industrial cybersecurity are increased concerns about the cloud. And we've got so many people that have gone to the cloud for all the reasons that we've talked about in terms of remote access and efficiencies gained and all that. Love to get your take in terms of, are there additional security concerns that people should be aware of in utilizing the cloud to its full advantage?
Yeah. So there's often this term like, oh, the cloud is just somebody else's computer. The thing is, like, many of the same problems that you see else in other environments exist in the cloud as well.
Yeah.
And that sort of lack of awareness happens not just in OT environments, but also in the cloud. I mean, frequently we hear about S3 buckets just being left with public access, where anybody can start downloading all the data from them, right? It's just like the whole thing with like default users and default passwords and default settings, right? That oftentimes is in the cloud as well, and which is how we end up with these types of incidents. I would say if you're moving to the cloud, potentially one of the biggest other things you want to really think about is how easy it is to expand the attack surface, right? Cloud computing, among other things, is like virtual computing, but taken at scale. Like they've taken virtual computing and just made it so easy. Like how long does it take to spin up a new EC2 instance, right? Log into my account, a few clicks, I can have a new EC2 instance up, publicly facing on the internet in a couple of minutes, which is great. I mean, this is the pace of innovation these days. Like we want that sort of that ease of use, that fast paced of technology. But at the same time, the ability to build out new technologies at scale also means you're able to replicate insecure configurations at scale, right? Yeah. So that's something to think about for anybody who's moving into the cloud. It's whatever you're thinking is the benefits are and what a multiplier that is. There's also this multiplier on the reverse side from your security posture and from your attack surface. And so just be mindful of that.
Well, and just to be clear, we're not saying don't go to the cloud. Just don't think that you're automatically secure by going to the cloud. I think that's the biggest misnomer.
Don't think that AWS is going to make me secure. Take a hard look at the AWS shared responsibility model, right? Azure and GCP have the similar models there. Some parts of the cloud compute environment are under Amazon's security purview. Other parts of it are not. Do you know which side of which you're falling on, right? And a lot of folks don't realize this and don't know about it, and probably never heard of the shared responsibility model. Take a hard look at that. Understand where it is that your organization needs to step in to be responsible for security, and which are the ones where you can effectively delegate to AWS.
Yeah, no different than kind of what we were talking about before in terms of adding new components, new machines, new devices. It's a shared responsibility. To quote The Rock, know your role, right, in terms of understanding what to do. As we kind of wrap up, Huxley, this has been awesome. Any other trends, things that we should know about going forward, maybe over the next year and a half or so when it comes to industrial cybersecurity?
Yeah, so this is something I don't know, but I wonder about, right? Cybersecurity insurance premiums have gone up in the last year, right? Significantly. So what does that mean for industrial control system environments, right? If we look at the risk management matrix, right, there's risk avoidance, risk acceptance, risk transfer, and risk mitigation. And insurance is a risk transfer treatment of risk. If the insurance premiums go up, what would be the treatment that would be adopted by organizations who can no longer afford those premiums? Do they go to risk mitigation, meaning they're adding more controls or buying more tools? Or do they go with risk acceptance or risk avoidance? Probably not avoidance, because they don't want to shut down, right? Availability is very important. So it might be just risk acceptance at that point, which is probably not the best solution or best outcome for just society in general. Like we don't want to just put our heads into the sand like ostriches and say, it's going to be fine. So, what is the impact of cybersecurity insurance on ICS environments since premiums have gone up? I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I'm very interested to see what that's going to look like, particularly with manufacturers.
Yeah. Well, you would hope potentially, taking a glass half full type of perspective, maybe this is another thing that when it gets talked about in the boardroom, it reinforces the need for investment in cybersecurity on the OT side of things. And I guess I'm hopeful that as we're investing more money into that, there comes a training element that's involved in really identifying and kind of advancing OT security specialists, because I think that's the biggest thing that we need right now in manufacturing. So
yeah. And you know what, just like for anybody that's sort of in the industry that isn't as familiar with OT, there's a growing number of training materials and classes that you can take on OT security, which I think is super helpful. And it behooves many of us in the industry to learn more about OT, because I mean, if an e-commerce site that you protect goes down and that's bad for the business. But like when the water treatment facility goes down, when the railroad goes down, like there are major ramifications for society in general.
Yeah.
And so it just boggles the mind that things that are so important to how our world works are so shockingly unprotected.
Thanks. And for more information on the work Huxley and his colleagues do, you can check them out at runZero.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or MBTmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Huxley Barbee, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.